It's been a while. So, in the past videos, I've gone over some broader aspects of apologetics and attempted to summarize some of what I believe are key issues to apologetics. Things like taking 1 Peter 3:15, the main text for apologetics, out of context and using it in a way that completely changes the meaning of its language. Using that passage and others with bad exegesis to promote a form of layperson apologetics that doesn't exist in Scripture. I've more positively looked at the 1 Peter passage and situated it in its context to look at how Scripture speaks of the task and method of apologetics. And I've essentially brought back into view the Reformed doctrine concerning the keys of the kingdom, that evangelism and preaching the gospel is a duty of pastors and teachers, rather than every layperson, and that Scripture distinguishes from that layperson's witness, which doesn't involve teaching, preaching, or other tasks that involve authority. And I've tried to anticipate and properly apply a major argument that I've seen some people misuse, which is taking passages that specifically speak to pastors and teachers and applying them in a general way to lay people. So, very broadly, that is the main gist of what I've covered so far. But in the background study for all of that, and while furthering study for other aspects of apologetics, I've learned certain things about ethics, especially in relation to hope. And I just wanted to shift focus and start going in that direction. So there's a lot that I'd like to go over with in ethics. In fact, I already recorded a video trying to cover everything in as brief a manner as I could, but that video ended up being over an hour long. It's far too long, and it's sort of a fire hose of information. So instead, I'm going to go at it in smaller segments and try to be more brief in my explanation. In fact, we're barely going to be going into ethics proper today because I want to look at a few things that I believe are foundational to ethics. As in all other studies, with ethics, the theoretical undergirds and informs the practical. So jumping into the practical without exploring and exposing the theoretical underpinnings is tantamount to casting aside intellectual integrity. And even worse, glossing over the theoretical side of ethics to grab a hold of the practical is an assertion of duty without concern for reality and reason and motivation. And it carries with it a sort of spirit of slavery. Thou shalt do this. There's some validity and a proper place for binding oneself to the worthy ethical practice, but the true spirit of ethics is not merely asserting and blindly obeying the particulars or externals of what must be done. Rather, it's informing the human conscience to discern what must be done precisely on the basis of the theoretical why. It's not following the letter of the law, but wisdom that comprises the spirit of ethics. Not a code of conduct, but underlying principles that intimately involve us as people who are relational, as people with emotions and desires and thoughts. Rather than simply the surface question, what should I do? We consider with greater depth and breadth, how do I know what I should do? So the practical without the theoretical is more or less just a facade. It's like virtue signaling, and it's not appreciated by our peers around us or by God. The ethic that's desired is an ethic of the heart, but it's immediately apparent also that unless the theory of ethics is implemented in practice, it's not truly ethics at all, but broadly speaking, a lie. Therefore, the true theory and practice of ethics has an organically unifying principle, and furthermore, this principle must truly exist. So something that has consistently come up time and again while studying is this sort of philosophical or maybe metaphysical framework of relationship. Basically, when looking at how certain things relate, you can understand it in one of three ways. By separation, by integration, or by this sort of relationship of tension and harmony. And these relationships can further be passive or active, but we won't get too much into that today. These frameworks seemingly involve at least 7 things, probably more, but for the purpose of brevity, I'll just list 7 things, and some of them won't even come up as I'm discussing it today, probably. So the specific things that I see within these frameworks are God and creation, the relationship of those 2 things, spiritual and physical, the realm of meaning and realm of futility, and I'll talk more about that in a future video. New age and old age, or feudal age, is how I like to view it. New creation and feudal creation, spirit and flesh, and then purpose and ethics. It seems that for people who are consistent in their views, viewing one of these topics in one of the frameworks logically results in viewing other topics within that same framework. So I'll give an example first with the Gnostics. Without delving too deeply in their beliefs or nitpicking at peripheral issues, Gnostics view the relationship between their God and creation as one of separation or dichotomy. God is to be understood only as transcendent to creation, and subsequently, they would identify this separation in the spiritual and the physical, to which they attach moral value of good and evil, respectively. And it ultimately trickles down into their view of purpose and ethics. Typically, this kind of separation is understood as dualism. The Gnostic framework is through and through dualistic in this way. It's principally a view of a sharp separation or dichotomy. And in their ethics, this results in a view where the purpose of ethics and the meaningfulness of ethics are transcendent to creation and physical things and our experience, and ultimately the meaningfulness and purpose of ethics are transcendent to ethics themselves. Our ethics, our moral activity, and the things we do are more or less kind of arbitrary, and the goal is instead to become more spiritual by means of asceticism, denial of earthly pleasures and things, fasting, meditation, prayer, and so forth. In other words, it's what many have called being so heavenly minded that you are of no earthly good. For Gnostics, the good, the goal of ethics, is ultimately only this future kind of transcendent thing that we don't achieve until we shed our physical bodies and we're completely free of this physical creation. So there's an eschatological dimension which especially arises in Gnostic perversions of Christianity. Some popular postmillennial theologians accuse amillennials of this kind of dualistic separation in their eschatology. And to be fair, there have been a few self-proclaimed amillennials that have some level of dualism in their views. And dualism like this has been a real issue in the history of the church. But not all amillennials hold to this, and I would argue most amillennials are not at all dualistic in their views. So, there are frameworks with this basal assumption of a separation, but there's also some who swing the opposite direction, like Aristotle, but we can look more holistically at sort of an integrative framework, one that's integrative at practically every level. We can consider pantheism. So pantheism views that God is in all things and that he is all things. In an idealistic pantheism, all of reality exists as some sort of partial manifestation of a single spiritual entity. Nothing is truly feudal, but it's all a part of God, and it finds this sort of deterministic meaning by its existence as part of him. The distinction of good and evil is more or less this illusion of finite creatures trying to comprehend this transcendent spirit that is in everything, and that is all things, essentially. However, ethics is not indifferent for pantheism in the same way that it is for Gnosticism, because all of reality is a part of God. Our moral choices do have weight and purpose. So in their view, determinism then doesn't contradict individual choice, but it somehow gives us agency to choose in a meaningful way that will ultimately result in the best outcome as determined by sort of the spirit. Ultimately, this sort of view, rather than establishing any basis for knowledge, for meaning, for choice, and so forth, it does nothing more than obfuscate any kind of knowledge claim behind the limit of our finitude, as creatures attempting to grasp transcendent spirit in all things. If we think back to a framework of separation, ethics becomes impractical because its goal transcends our reality. Well, within a framework of integration, ethics denies the reality of good and evil. To some extent, they become illusory, and the goal of ethics is not one that renders lasting meaning to our activity and clarity as to understanding what is ethically good. But there's sort of this denial or ignorance of transience, of suffering and evil, and reason, but also denial of the transcendent things that are pointed to varying extents. Separative approaches always seem to demand that we lay aside practicality, while integrative approaches seem to demand that we lay aside reason, and anything that goes beyond practicality. Finally, distinct from these two views, one can view things as in a relationship of harmony and tension. I would argue that this is how Scripture explains things. It isn't a combination or a middle ground of the other two frameworks, although it might seem that way in some points. But we can start with God in creation. So in this sort of framework of harmony and tension, God is absolutely distinct from creation. He's wholly other, but not such that creation is then inherently evil. He relates to creation such that creation must be understood as in God in some sense, and as at base reflective of his nature, at least analogically. So there's these clear distinctions, but also these clear relationships. There's sort of this tension and this harmony. God is constantly upholding creation and working in it, but at the same time, we avoid swinging into this pantheistic conception of God. We don't become pantheistic or panentheistic. There's a harmony and tension of things existing in organic unity, but also in distinction. The spiritual and physical exist alongside each other. They're in some way connected and related, but still distinct. New creation exists alongside of and in harmony with old creation. But that existence has tension, just as with the new nature in the spirit and our old nature of the flesh. And ultimately, the goal of ethics is distinct from ethics, but in an essential harmony with ethics, so that it isn't in a dichotomous separation from our ethic and our experience, but it also isn't integrated immanently in the ethics or in creation. There's tension between our ethics and the goal for which we live ethically. How we distinguish separation, integration, and the tension and harmony ultimately goes into metaphysics and questions of being, which are very complex. So we won't touch into the metaphysics too much. But these frameworks eventually touch on how we view ethics eschatologically. What is the relationship of the now and the not yet, and how does that affect ethics? We don't want to view it dualistically, dichotomizing the present and the future, and in so doing, say that the ethical reality for which we live is only far off in the future, and totally transcendent to our earthly lives. We also don't want to flatten things and integrate the future into the present to such an extent that we become blind to the reality and purpose of the present realities and how they serve and become the basis for future realities. Think of it in terms of the ancient Christian doctrine of the two ways. So the touch point of ethics and eschatology is not just about salvation in new creation, but also about judgment in old creation. these two eschatological ends come to head in the same event, Christ's second coming. The judgment is not just of people, um, because God's curse involves not only people, but all of creation. So it seems that to suggest eschatological salvation integrates into the present in such a way that it transforms the domain of the curse is to deny an aspect of judgment. And rather than establishing authority as an existing reality with purpose, it denies this sort of authority that exists in reality with purpose. It's an injustice. There's a lot more that can be said in the way of that, but that's also for a future video. So this all is a very summarized explanation of the framework view that I'm trying to work out. There's a lot of complexity and several layers to it with ethics, and many difficult questions when you get down to details. But I think if it can't make sense in a simple explanation, which is what I've tried to offer, then there's always a danger that it's just sophistry and mental gymnastics. Hopefully, with just giving a broad view to these frameworks, it makes sense to you why I believe recognizing them might become more important for ethics down the line, especially when we get into ethics first as grounded in and oriented to the first cause of one's framework, and second as something eschatological and hopeful, which is a bit farther down the line.